and welcome to China Now with me, Makiza Latifa. Happy New Year and thanks for joining us. We begin with China Currents, where we look at the key developments shaping China's domestic priorities and its relations with the rest of the world. China has launched an unannounced live-fire military drill aimed at testing responses to what it describes as growing coordination between the United States and Taiwan. And as Beijing signals its firm stance on regional security. And at the same time, China's foreign minister, in his annual policy review, says China-US relations are now meeting head-on, reflecting heightened strategic competition between the world's two largest economies. Meanwhile, as artificial intelligence places increasing strain on United States power supplies, China is finding new outlets for its surplus electricity, turning energy capacity into a strategic advantage in the global technology race. We've got details of these stories and many more coming up shortly. Please do stay.
Now let's start today's China Currents. From December 29th to December 30th, without any prior public notice, the Eastern Theater Command of the Chinese People's Liberation Army mobilized ground forces, the Navy, the Air Force, and a rocket force to conduct military drills in multiple areas, including the Taiwan Strait, north of Taiwan, southwest of Taiwan, southeast of Taiwan, and east of the island. The drill, named Justice Mission, drew great attention for several reasons. First, it openly demonstrated the PLA's capability to assert command over Taiwan. In footage broadcast by China Central Television, a PLA officer was heard reporting, "We have received HIMARS target data, commencing fire." Just half a month earlier, the United States had pledged the largest ever arms sale to Taiwan, including 82 HIMARS launch systems as a heavyweight item. After the exercise ended, China also released drone footage showing a top-down view of Taipei's landmark Taipei 101. Another notable feature was the tight secrecy. Unlike before Russia's attack on Ukraine, when US intelligence issued repeated public warnings, this PLA exercise was revealed only once it was already underway. Furthermore, the mainland military released comparison maps of joint exercise zones over the years, showing that the encirclement of Taiwan has steadily tightened. Meng Xiangqing, a professor of China National Defense University, specifically pointed out that this exercise also included scenarios aimed at blocking US military assistance to Taiwan. Next, let's look at how recent developments in Venezuela have triggered a growing sense of crisis in China. After US forces moved into Venezuela this week and detained President Nicolas Maduro, Chinese companies are increasingly worried that their local investment and facilities could be damaged, seized, or placed under hostile control. According to reporting by the South China Morning Post, China has built and operated a wide range of strategic infrastructure in Venezuela, spanning satellite ground facilities, oil field systems, and national telecommunication networks. Among the most sensitive assets is the El Sombrero satellite tracking station at Captain Manuel Rios Air Base, together with a backup facility in Luepa, Bolivar State. These sites support Venezuela's only functioning remote sensing satellite current in orbit. The stations were constructed by China Great Wall Industry Corporation, a subsidiary of China's state aerospace sector, and handled telemetry, tracking, and command operations for the civilian Earth observation satellite VRSS-2, which China developed and launched for Venezuela in 2017. China is also Venezuela's largest foreign investor and one of its key crude oil buyers. Engineers from China National Petroleum Corporation helped modernize aging oil fields by installing advanced drilling rigs, water injection systems, and upgrading refineries, lifting productions by as much as 8-fold in some areas. On Sunday, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio stated that Washington does not need Venezuelan oil, but would not allow the enemies of the U.S. to control the country's energy resources, a remark widely interpreted as targeting China and Russia. China's footprint in Venezuela's digital infrastructure is likewise under threat. Firms such as Huawei and ZTE, which help build the backbone of country's communication systems, from nationwide 4G networks and handset assembly lines to cybersecurity platforms, now face the prospect of contract terminations, new restrictions or even sanctions under potentially pro-US government. Next, let's take a break from tense geopolitics and turn our attention to China's vast Gobi Desert. There, China is busy managing its electricity surplus, a sweet headache, while US faces power shortages due to AI. On the Gobi Desert outside Gormor in Qinghai province, China has built a row of distinctive white giant tanks. Inside them is liquid air cooled to -194 degrees Celsius. This is the world's largest liquid air energy storage power station, vividly known as a supercooled air battery, designed to address the volatility of wind and solar power generation. Electricity is the lifeblood of modern society, and power is like running water. If it cannot be stored in time, it simply flows away. With these white batteries in the desert, when electricity generated by wind turbines and solar panels exceed demand, compressors inside the tanks compress and cool air into liquid form for storage. When there is no sunlight at night or during periods of peak demand, the liquid air is released to meet the shortfall. Over a year, the total output is expected to reach 180 million kilowatt-hours, enough to supply electricity to 30,000 households. This not only prevents the waste of wind and solar energy, but also stabilizes the power grid. Although countries such as UK are also building similar facilities, for example, the plant in Carrington, Manchester, is under construction and expected to be completed in 2026 and start operation in 2027, its scale is only about half of China's project. Now let's turn to the latest developments in Chinese industry, where both electric vehicles and humanoid robot companies have reached new milestones. According to CNBC on January 2nd local time, the US electric vehicle maker Tesla announced that its global EV sales in 2025 were surpassed for the first time by China's BYD, making BYD the world's largest EV seller. Tesla delivered 1.636 million vehicles worldwide in 2025, down about 8.6% year-on-year, making the company's second consecutive year of declining deliveries. BYD announced on January 1st that it delivered 4.6 million vehicles in 2025, up 7.7% from 2024, including 2.25 million electric vehicles, a year-on-year increase of 28%. Beyond electric vehicles, China's humanoid robots are also on the cusp of entering consumer market. Leading company Unitree has announced the opening of its first offline experience store in partnership with JD.com in Shuangjing, one of Beijing's busiest commercial districts. The store displays products such as the G1 humanoid robot and the Go-To quadruped robotic dog. Customers can experience the products on-site and purchase them directly or place orders by scanning QR codes. Prices range from $14,000 to $92,000 depending on the level of sophistication of the robots. The next story concerns Chinese companies once again being treated unfairly on the so-called national security grounds. By the end of this month, the British USB bridge chip designer FTDI, held by China-based Zhiguang Asset Management, will be forced to sell. In December 2021, Zhiguang Asset Management completed the $440 million acquisition of 80.2% of FTDI, which was seen as a strategic move by Chinese capital into the high-end analog chip sector. However, less than 3 years later, the deal ran into trouble. On November 5th last year, the UK government suddenly launched a retrospective review under the retroactive scrutiny clause of the National Security and Investment Act 2021 and issued a final order requiring FTDI Holding Limited to sell off all its 80.2% stake in FTDI within a specified period. People close to the Chinese company said, under government pressure, the tight timeline makes meaningful negotiations impossible. A forced sale will likely be far below the company's real value, leaving the company and its shareholders facing massive losses. This comes on the heels of the Netherlands' coercive takeover of Nexperia, a wholly Chinese-owned company, in September last year. In recent years, the China-US technology war has intensified. The UK has tightened semiconductor export controls against China. Official UK data show that in 2023, the British government rejected 14 license applications to provide semiconductor technologies to China, far higher than in previous years. Looking back, the last successful acquisition of a British semiconductor company by Chinese capital may date back to 2017, and Chinese media report that these actions clearly indicate the UK semiconductor sector has become a no-go zone for Chinese investors. And that's all for today. See you next time.
And now we turn to the Thinkers Forum, where we take a deeper look at the global forces shaping today's geopolitical landscape. This episode features Pepe Escobar, the well-known Brazilian journalist and international affairs commentator. So in his analysis, he examines what he describes as Trump's Great Retreat and its implications for Venezuela, explores whether current US-China relations represent a calm before the storm, and takes a closer look at the intensifying race between Washington and Beijing in the field of artificial intelligence.
Financial and narrative dominance. I think this is the absolute key when we study the American model for AI. The Silicon Valley big tech model for AI, extremely concentrated, dominated by some very, very few players, maybe not more than 5 or 6, and profit driven, which is the absolute opposite of the Chinese model. So, the AI big tech boom in the US is related to Wall Street. This means speculative capital, not productive capital, and not productive in the sense of producing knowledge for the average citizens or improving their knowledge on every field. The Chinese system is the absolute opposite because it's the AI system in China is essentially open. And this has been planned not only in the 5-year plans, but in Made in China 2025, where China is basically reaching all the targets that they had in mind 10 years ago this year, which is an extraordinary achievement, right? And that most of the best brains related to AI in China are back in China. These new Chinese startups, the progress that they are making in semiconductors, all that is interrelated. And it's an organic process. When you look at the American process, you see 4 or 5 or 6 tycoons in big tech in Silicon Valley trying to come up with a system where they control everything. And some of them are even more worrying because when you look at their speeches and how they are marketing themselves, they are absolute freaks for total domination. I refer specifically to the Palantir people. Very, very, very dangerous, probably more dangerous than the others. They want total control. They want total control on everybody. They want to control the fabrication of narratives as well. And it gets even worse because now they are implanted inside the federal government in the United States. Palantir is part of the federal government machine now. Databases, facial recognition, you name it. We are at a critical crossroads because, for instance, it's easy to understand how China wants to become an AI power. But we assume that this will revert to the benefit of the Chinese population, mostly. Of course, there are instances of control, of security control. This makes sense. If it's not abused, it makes sense. But mostly AI in China, if this dream of having a society in China fully automatized and fully run or controlled by artificial intelligence, if it's productive, and if it turns people's lives into something more, they have more free time to study or to enrich themselves, fine. As long as it's not related, first of all, to total control in an Orwell sense, of a complete control of everybody and repressing everybody, or in the American sense of they want to control everybody because they don't want debate, they don't want dissent, they don't want different opinions in the public sphere. And we can see that already in the US internet, which is heavily controlled now and heavily censored. They don't allow, especially when it comes to sensitive issues like Gaza, for instance, or what's happening to Venezuela, you're not allowed to to have different opinions in the US internet. So it's very, very dangerous because we seem to be going towards a path of indiscriminate control of a select, self-elected group of technocrats, and we can call them, some of us start calling them during the COVID times, techno-feudalists. One of the articles that I wrote during COVID was exactly an article about techno-feudalism. And there was a French researcher at Sorbonne in Paris who wrote a small book about techno-feudalism. He was the first one. A small book, was not translated, but what he conceptualized was extremely important. He saw where we're going now in terms of this concentration of technology in the hands of few people who think that they can, that they have divine powers. This is very, very dangerous. Venezuela question is something mind-boggling for most people who live in Latin America, and I'm sure for a lot of people all across the global south, including our Chinese friends, all of you, in fact. It started as a war on drugs, or a remix of the American war on drugs, which was centered basically in Colombia in the past. They came up with a non-existent cartel, which was then fully demonized by the whole machine of the American government. This cartel doesn't exist. This cartel is a fabrication of the US State Department. And everybody who follows, I would say, the drug connection across South America, Caribbean, Latin America knows that these drugs come mainly from Colombia and from Mexico. You have a lot of Peruvians who are smugglers. You have a lot of drugs that come from Brazil, in fact, air freight, in fact. So Venezuela is a minor player in this flow of drugs to the US, maybe as a transit point. And even that, it's not one of the major transit points. But this was the rationale by the Trump 2.0 administration to start their, I wouldn't say war against Venezuela, but the next step of a hybrid war against Venezuela that's been going on for 20 years at least. And it's hybrid, but now it's getting kinetic and it's getting relatively hot. Then they changed the angle slightly because they were being ridiculed even inside the United States. Yeah, you're doing a war on drugs against the wrong opponent. And it turned into a very sophisticated regime change operation. So the rhetoric changed slightly, and then President Maduro of Venezuela was being demonized as, once again, the new Hitler, the new whatever, narco trafficker, you name it, autocrat, now narco trafficker, you name it. And now it's even worse because now it's derailing into practically comic book territory, but in a very perverse way. Now it's Pirates of the Caribbean. The American government, with this largest armada in the Caribbean and in Latin America since the Bay of Pigs in 1962, they are stealing oil from Venezuela tanker by tanker. This is completely absurd, but it proves one thing, I would say, to China, to Russia, to the BRICS nations, to the global majority, proves the impotence of the empire, in fact. In the past, it was very easy for the US to overthrow governments in Latin America. They didn't even need the color revolutions. They just needed to buy the right military and stage a coup. Then it turned into attempts at color revolutions. And nowadays, not even with all this pressure and this mix of threats to launch a sort of Iraq 2003 shock and awe operation against Caracas, threats of sending Navy SEALs to capture the president or to immobilize him or to bring him to justice to the US, attempts at a color revolution when they don't understand that the Bolivarian revolution in Venezuela is very popular and the let's say, the proletariat in Venezuela and the middle classes, they support the Bolivarian revolution. And the local intelligence that Americans have on the ground are people who are completely disconnected on how Venezuela works. Not even in all these assets, let's put it this way, the US is capable to intimidate Venezuela. And very, very important, to finish off this first appraisal, the fact that in the background, Venezuela can count on support at various levels from China, from Russia, and from Iran. So Trump now is cornered by himself, in fact, because he, as usual, Trump is a master creator of narratives. He created such a crazy narrative that he was going to, take care of the Venezuela problem, isolate the narco traffickers, bring a democracy or whatever. And now he's stuck with his enormous armada, which is impotent to do anything practical against Venezuela, apart from a blockade, which will be breached sooner or later with help from China, from Iran, and from Russia, 3 BRICS countries. So once again, very, very important. This war may be against Venezuela, but it's also a war against BRICS and a war against 3 major BRICS players, China, Russia, and Iran. So nothing has changed in terms of how the Trump 2.0 administration views the world. It's a war between a declining empire and an ascending multipolar world, represented especially by these 3 great BRICS nations. The role of the BRICS in the Venezuelan crisis is very complex because there are divergences inside the BRICS and on the BRICS table on how to deal with this blatant attack against Venezuela's sovereignty. To start with, Venezuela by now should have been at least a partner of BRICS, if not a full member. This is also a very, very complicated story because some BRICS members actually vetoed Venezuela to become a partner or a full member. I prefer not to get into details now because this is something that the BRICS themselves have to study on the table and know that Venezuela would be a very, very important added partner or full member, especially in terms of consolidating, let's say, the Latin American section of BRICS. But in terms of how BRICS is being attacked indirectly in the case of Venezuela, this is clear. Venezuela is an enormous wealthy country in terms of natural resources, most of them unexplored. It is in a very sensitive area which the United States considers its backyard, literally. And this is absolutely obvious in the latest national security strategy of the United States, where probably the number 1 priority for them now under Trump 2.0 is to totally reconquer and conquer and subdue what they call their backyard, the Western Hemisphere, which is State Department language for the whole of Latin America. The Americans under Trump now are saying, this is our backyard, everything there is ours, we do what we want, and we don't admit foreign interference, which is coded language against especially China, Russia, and Iran, which have very good relations with Venezuela. So that's why this is an indirect war against BRICS, but in a very direct way, in fact, because everybody knows the support that Venezuela have with these major BRICS partners. The fact that Venezuela is respected all across the global south because they had a popular Bolivarian revolution that basically, even against all odds and against a torrent of sanctions by the Americans, managed to survive. That's a miracle in itself, right? And even with all the spin, all the 24/7 campaigns by Western mainstream media, American and also European, they still resist. And even the fact that they are there's a counterpower against them, even inside Latin America. There are many now conservative governments in Latin America, like Argentina and now the new government of Chile, which are totally against Venezuela. And so they resist against everything. And popular mobilization, which is something that we have seen this past few 2 to 3 months. The population is mobilized. They understand that the country is under attack, directly and indirectly. They know that they cannot count on a lot of help from abroad, except in different levels, Russia, China, and Iran, and not much from their own neighbors in Latin America, and still they resist. So this is an example for the global South as a whole of a country defending its sovereignty. And this is a matter that is extremely important, for instance, for President Xi Jinping and for President Putin. On China and Russia, the key theme, and the key theme that unites China and Russia, is sovereignty. And they respect countries who defend their sovereignty and affirm their sovereignty. This is not ideological at all. It doesn't matter if it's a rightist government power, a leftist government power, a coalition. No, this is in terms of the integrity of a nation state. So this is respected all over the global South. And everybody with a minimum of information about Venezuela can see that all these different levels of war, war on drugs, regime change, Pirates of the Caribbean, taking up tankers, this has everything to do with those immense reserves of oil that the empire now, under the national security strategy, basically is saying this is ours, or it was ours, it was confiscated, and we want it back, which is a completely false narrative. But this is the narrative that they are trying to sell to their own public opinion. And a lot of aware Americans can see that this is completely absurd. So Trump and his staff, that is not only anti-Venezuela, but anti-sovereignty in Latin America, starting with the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who is totally obsessed with 3 countries, Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. So Rubio's foreign policy, if we could put it on a headline, is, I want regime change in Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. That's it. There's nothing else. And Rubio doesn't understand anything about the Middle East or East Asia, for that matter. The only thing that he knows about is these 3 nations. Why? Because they have powerful donors in Miami, in Florida, of their diasporas who contribute to Rubio's career. So in his mind, it's only about conquering more power and satisfying the demands of these high-level donors, especially the Cuban diaspora, very, very strong in Miami, and the Venezuela diaspora, also very strong across Florida. So this is an internal American matter that interferes with their foreign policy. So obviously, if you have Marco Rubio telling Trump every day, you have to do something about Venezuela, because Trump, first of all, he doesn't read. He doesn't read intelligence reports. He doesn't listen to serious intelligence reports. He doesn't know much about Latin America except, I would say, real estate opportunities. And he doesn't know about the politics of Venezuela, obviously. So it's very easy for Rubio to tell him, no, we have to go there because they are bringing drugs to the US. And Trump has bought this narrative without evidence, which is the craziest thing. So that's why this problem is so, it involves not only Latin America, but it involves the whole global South. Because if the US manages to break Venezuela this way, illegally, in every respect, this opens them to try to break any other country in Latin America and beyond. Well, we can say that at the moment, US-China relations, let's say they are in a sort of lull, or maybe some sort of calm for a while before the storm comes back. So let's say within the next few months, maybe there won't be any storms, right? They will be inevitable, I would say sooner rather than later, because from the point of view of the Trump 2.0 administration, and from the point of view of the ruling elites in the US, the people who really run the United States in the background, old money, the big families, those invisible investors in mega hedge funds. These are the real rulers of America who control these Atlanticist relations. They are scared of the rise of China. There's no other way to put it. I prefer to go straight to the point. In fact, they are terrified that China is already the number one commercial trade power in the world. Soon it will become the number one geoeconomic power in the world. And it's already one of the top geopolitical powers in the world. So from the point of view of remember, only 25 years ago, they thought that this would be their American century again. For them, psychologically, it's impossible to admit Chinese competition in every sector, especially now where China is able to compete in every high-tech sector. They were never expecting that until a few years ago. There was a campaign of demonization of China copies everything. They are incapable of original scientific breakthroughs. China proves every week that they are capable of scientific breakthroughs. This terrifies their elites completely, including the big tech elite, including people like Elon Musk in Silicon Valley or NVIDIA. When you have the CEO of NVIDIA basically saying that, China is nanoseconds behind us, basically he's saying, no, they're going to overtake us even before you start thinking. So none of that was foreseen by American experts until a few months ago, in fact. So how do you deal with that? Once again, coming back to the national security strategy, they are refining containment strategies. It can be, for instance, the Quad, where they're trying to pull India inside the Quad, and the Indians are looking and seeing that they have better options if they are close to BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and their India-Russia partnership. The latest visit of Putin to India, he was received like a god, practically, So India-Russia relationship is, I would say, it's almost as close as Russia-China relationship. And this is all within BRICS, right? What does the US has to offer to all these huge Eurasia powers? Nothing, literally nothing. What does the US has to offer to the Western Hemisphere, to Latin America? A few investments here and there, not much, not productive investments or investing in their industries, these countries in Western Hemisphere, nothing. So they're trying to buy, we can describe fifth columns, infiltrated agents, a little bit everywhere in the world. They tried with Central Asia. Our audience, all of you, I'm sure you have noticed the visit of the 5 Central Asian leaders to Washington, where they had a banquet with Trump. They said, you are fantastic, you're a great president, president of peace, blah, blah, blah. And the next day, they came back to Central Asia, continued to do our business, mostly with Russia and China. So all this spin doesn't change facts. And coming to the question of spin, because this is a declining empire with a huge internal division, polarized internally, losing competitiveness everywhere in the world, not only against China, but against other powers as well. And an empire divided, of course, they produce narratives. They cannot produce facts. Who's producing facts? China, Iran, India, Turkey, African countries developing very fast. These are producing facts, not narratives. So the empire comes back to issuing threats or intimidations. When they launched the latest round of tariffs against China, the Chinese looked at the empire, okay, all right, this is not going to change the way we're doing business. So they had to back off. They were not expecting, they're expecting China to fold. It didn't work. Like it's not working with Venezuela. They expect Venezuela to fold in a matter of days. Venezuela is resisting. So this drives them even crazier because one thing is to produce narratives. Another thing is to change facts on the ground. It's the same thing in the very complicated war in Ukraine, which was a war that was initiated by the Americans, followed by the Europeans. It became a war of the collective West against Russia using Ukraine, and now they're losing on the ground. These are facts. These are not narratives. So whatever you hear from Kiev or from Brussels, it doesn't alter the facts on the ground, where the Russians are doing what they are doing, demilitarizing Kiev and NATO at the same time, and getting to their targets. This is the difference between facts on the ground and narratives. So the US now under Trump is caught in, I would say, a web of narratives. And most of these narratives, they clash against each other. So one day Trump says, we're going to have a peace in Ukraine next week. The next day he says, oh, no, Putin is a killer. But, it doesn't make sense. And same thing with China. We have a good relationship with China. Next week, we're preparing a new batch of sanctions. So there's no strategic thinking. Even the tactics are very infantile, and there's no continuity. When you compare this government policy or non-policy with the way the government in Beijing and the government of Moscow deal with real life problems and how they have long-term strategies, not only 5-year plans like in China, but in Russia, they have a plan to develop their Far East and Siberia. Long-term plan, Chinese style. This is facts on the ground, changing facts on the ground. And reverting to the US, we have this national security strategy, once again, which is, it's very good for the whole Global South to look at this document because they now can see clearly what the US is up to from now on. And it does not look good. When you talk about the old order breaking down. Yes, the old order is breaking down very fast. And the new order that is rising maybe is not rising as fast as we wanted, but it is already rising. So that's why this historical period is something, wow, President Xi Jinping, I like the way he put it in the first place, that we are seeing changes we have not seen in 100 years. That's very close to what it's happening today. We have not seen these changes since the start of the First World War. No question about that. And for instance, okay, this is the Italian version of the book, but it's not a book about specifically the new multipolar century, because this is a collection of columns and essays that I wrote essentially last year. So what they do in these books, they document more or less the end of a paradigm, the end of the previous unipolar world, the end of what the Americans were calling rules-based international order. So the last year was last year. So this is what more or less examined in the book, where the main characters of the book are the BRICS, China, Russia, and of course the emergence of the global South everywhere. But this year we are already in a new paradigm, which under Trump 2.0, we could describe as no rules, no international order, and based on no rules whatsoever. Or, once again, the rules that the Americans make. We come back to the national security strategy. This is the Americans basically establishing the new set of rules for the next few years at least. But obviously, we have to see what the Chinese are doing, what the Russians are doing, what the Turks are doing, what the Indians are doing. So these are the big powers of the emerging world, and they have a completely different set of aspirational rules. And they don't try to impose their rules on anybody else. That's the enormous difference between the US and these emerging powers across Eurasia, especially. They are inclusive. The empire is exclusive. And these new powers are inclusive. And that's why everyone wants to become a member of BRICS. because BRICS is inclusive, on the toe is respected. Now, if everyone's voice is heard, people are treated with equanimity and mutual respect, which is the exact opposite of the empire, especially now that the empire is cornered. They are getting more aggressive. And they cannot get too aggressive with the two big powers that matter, Russia and China. And once again, they are releasing their anger and their resentment and their impotence against weaker, smaller, weaker nations. And this is what the global south has to be extremely alert to try to counteract. I talk about this in the book, but within the previous paradigm. Now that we are in an even more serious paradigm and more dangerous, more volatile, well, next year there's going to be another book, obviously, to talk about this.
Up next, we turn to an open course from Fudan University Summer School of the Shanghai Institute of International Relations and Public Affairs. In this lecture titled Africa, History and Debt Theory, Professor Yin Zhiguang revisits and critically examines Hegel's long-debated claim that Africa has no history, offering a thoughtful reassessment of Africa's historical agency and its place in global intellectual discourse.
If you're coming from a political history background, you'll be very familiar with a Hegelian expression. Africa has no history. Africa doesn't have history. What does it even mean? Africa doesn't have a history. I mean, this is a question I always throw to my students. What does it mean that Africa doesn't have history?
It doesn't have its past.
No, I think that it's
What does it mean?
colonized.
Yeah.
It belongs to other cultures.
It's controlled by
Why? But I mean, we have platoons of students coming from Africa. You don't have your past. You don't have your grandma. Your grandma doesn't have a grandma.
The form of the past is not considered a civilization.
What do you mean? What do you mean by considered as civilization?
I think there's this dichotomous division between barbaric and civilized.
Right.
They're
Why do we need such a division?
because the past is not universal, I guess. It only belongs to Africa, but it can now be applied to different other continents.
Close. Very close.
a civilization is consisted of four parts, and Africa needs certain parts of it, so it's not
Do you come from a legal background?
yes.
That's a very normative explanation. I set a bar, I set a criteria. If you don't fit that criteria, you're not legal. Right? That's a norm. Don't laugh. In fact, pretty much all modern social scientists have applied or have been complying with that normative approach. That normative approach, in Wang Hui's lecture this morning, he used the term 抽象, abstract.
Yes.
Sorry, so we come up with, how do you say abstract? He used the term abstract. To Marx has a very, very exciting terminology to describe that word. He used the word dead theory. It's dead. In comparison, there is a theory that is still alive. What is a dead theory? What does it mean by dead theory? What does it mean? Why a theory? How come a theory could be dead?
If the theory can't explain the reality,
No. But good try.
It cannot. It has no proof.
It doesn't change. Fundamentally, Marx's argument revolves on one key phenomenon. The world is changing. the world is moving. Not only the world, it's a universal principle, right? This principle is universal. What does it mean? You are changing. Every single one of you is changing. The world, the physical world is changing. You use the word movement. Fundamentally, this is material dialecticism. Revolves on one crucial principle. The whole world. Doesn't matter if this is a physical world, or your mind, or your body, or the order of things. They're all moving. Once we start to recognize that the whole bloody world is moving, how on earth you will be able to explain the ever-changing world with a dead theory, i.e., a theory, a normative approach that understands the world as static. Right? Hey, civilization needs to meet the following criteria. 1, 2, 3, 4. If you don't meet that criteria, then you're not civilization. And I argue the other way. But this is not, well, Hegel is so smart, right? And his theory is so consistent. Of course, he's not one of that theorists that consider the world as dead. He's dialectical. So let's go back to Hegelian argument, saying that Africa doesn't have a history. But where does he come from? Africa doesn't have a history. Another crucial thing for theoretical discussion is that a theory needs to have a purpose. So we have another word. Teleological. How do you spell teleological? Teleology, right? Teleology. The moon. In Chinese, it's called moonilin. What's the point of your theory? My impression, the reason why IR, international relations, and arguably many of the social science discipline or subject areas are dead, largely because they don't have a purpose. Right? What's the point? I'm asking you, each one of you, what's the point of you sitting here? What's your purpose? What's the purpose of you studying whatever the subject that you're studying?
To learn something, acquire something.
To learn something. What do we learn? And then why do we have to learn? I sincerely and wholeheartedly agree. To change this bloody world. That's the whole point. And that, let's forget about Chairman Mao says the purpose of theory is to change this world. Let's forget about Chairman Xi says the purpose of understanding this world is to construct a new world. Let's forget about this. Let's talk about Hegel. Now, the only reason, the only logic behind Hegelian narrative of Africa doesn't have a history is because he has a purpose. What's the purpose of Hegel? To make everyone look alike. In this case, Europe. Hegelian's mark, when he talks about human history, a Hegelian's mark, the benchmark of Hegel, is that Europe represents the peak of human agency.
That brings us to the end of this edition of China Now here on Pan-African Television. So we explored key developments in China currents. We also had in-depth perspectives from our Thinkers Forum and concluded with an insightful open course from the Fudan University. Thank you all for joining us here on China Now. My name is Makiza Micheline Latifa. Please do well to send in your comments, your thoughts, your feedback and suggestions to the email provided below. Until next time, let China not be far away from you anymore.